Sometimes the heaviest inheritance isn't money or property, it's the silence between generations, the questions we never asked while we still had time. Dan Keller learned this at 54, standing in his dead grandfather's house after 20 years of silence and dust. He expected old furniture and faded memories. Instead, he found a wooden crate hidden between two sofas, filled with gold bars that shouldn't exist. Real gold. Unexplained wealth. His grandfather never said a word about it. The discovery changed everything Dan thought he knew about his family, about right and wrong, about the kind of father and man he wanted to be. What else had his grandfather hidden, and why? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dan Keller's alarm went off at 5:30 every morning, just as it had for the past 30 years. The sound was gentle, a soft chime. He'd chosen specifically so it wouldn't startle Aaron awake in the next room. At 54, Dan had learned that the small considerations mattered most. He'd learned it through divorce, through financial struggle, through watching his son navigate a world that wasn't built for someone with cerebral palsy. He'd learned it the hard way, which seemed to be the only way Dan learned anything. He stood in the kitchen of their small rental house, waiting for the coffee to brew. The place was tidy but worn linoleum that had seen better decades, cabinets that didn't quite close right, a refrigerator that hummed too loud. It was affordable, though, and the landlord didn't mind that Aaron needed accessibility modifications. Dan had installed the grab bars himself, widened the bathroom doorway, built a ramp for the front steps. Small considerations. "Morning, Dad." Aaron's voice came from the hallway, accompanied by the familiar rhythm of his gait, uneven but determined. At 28, Aaron had his mother's dark eyes and Dan's stubborn chin. He'd also inherited a sharp mind that Dan thanked God for every single day. "Morning, buddy. Coffee's almost ready." Dan pulled down 2 mugs, the routine so automatic his hands knew the motion in his sleep. "Got that lawyer letter yesterday," Aaron said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "About Grandpa Walter's house." Dan poured the coffee, added cream to Aaron's cup the way he liked it. "Yeah, I saw it. 20 years is a long time to leave a place sitting empty. Probate takes time when there's no clear will. Your great-uncle fought me on it for years." Dan sat down across from his son. "Doesn't matter now. It's ours. Or mine. Whatever." Aaron studied his father over the rim of his mug. "You don't sound excited." "It's just a house, Aaron. An old house full of old things belonging to a man I barely knew." That was true enough. Walter Keller had been a presence in Dan's childhood, not a person. He'd been the stern figure at occasional holiday dinners, the man who sent birthday cards with crisp $20 bills and no personal message. He'd been successful, an architect who designed government buildings and military installations during the Cold War. He'd had money, respect, and a modernist house in the woods that looked like something out of an architecture magazine. He'd also been cold, distant, the kind of grandfather who shook your hand instead of hugging you, who asked about grades but never about dreams. Dan's father, Walter's son, had died young, a heart attack at 42. After that, what little connection existed between Dan and Walter had dissolved entirely. Walter had attended the funeral, shaken Dan's hand, and then retreated to that glass and steel house in the woods. He'd lived another 15 years after that, dying quietly at 83, and somehow Dan had never found the time or the courage to visit. Not even once. "Still," Aaron said, "it's worth something. Property out there, even if the house is outdated." "We'll see. Hugh Penbrook, the estate lawyer, he says I need to go through it, clear it out. 20 years of sitting means there's probably mold, water damage, all sorts of problems." Dan sipped his coffee. "I'm thinking we take a weekend, see what's there, figure out if it's even worth keeping or if we should just sell it as is." "We—" Aaron's face lit up. "You want me to come?" "If you're up for it. I could use the company and the help, if I'm being honest. Aaron's smile was worth everything. Dan had learned, especially in the 5 years since Denise left, that giving Aaron purpose mattered more than protecting him from effort. His son needed to feel useful, capable, trusted. The divorce had been hard on Aaron, watching his mother choose a simpler life, one that didn't include the daily realities of caregiving. She called on birthdays and holidays now. She sent checks for medical expenses, guilty money that always felt too little and too late. Dan didn't blame her, not really. Caregiving was exhausting, relentless, and she'd done it for 23 years before something inside her just broke. But he'd never forgiven her for the look on Aaron's face when she explained she was leaving. That look of understanding, of resignation, of a young man realizing he was seen as a burden. "When do we go?" Aaron asked. "This weekend, Saturday morning. We'll make a day of it." The rest of the week passed in its usual rhythm. Dan worked 3 days at his part-time job with a local contracting company. Semi-retired, they called it, though it really meant they only needed him when they had more work than their younger crew could handle. He'd been a contractor for 30 years, building decks and additions and renovating kitchens across 3 counties. His body showed the wear a bad knee, a shoulder that ached in cold weather, hands that were starting to stiffen with arthritis. On Thursday, his neighbor, Lorraine, caught him bringing in groceries. "Dan, you got a minute?" She was 72, sharp as ever, with silver hair she wore in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Sure, Lorraine. What's up?" "Heard you inherited Walter Keller's place." She leaned on her cane, studying him. "That's quite something. News travels fast. Small town. People talk." She paused. "I knew your grandfather, you know. Not well, but we crossed paths over the years. He was at the library often, always researching something. Architecture journals, history books, government documents." Dan set the grocery bags down. "What was he like? I mean, really like?" Lorraine considered the question. "Complicated, brilliant, certainly, but troubled. After about 1982, maybe 83, something changed in him. He became more withdrawn, stopped coming to town events. Used to be you'd see him at the Historical Society meetings, the Planning Commission hearings, then one day he just stopped showing up anywhere. Any idea? Why? No. But people noticed. Some said he'd had a falling out with a business partner. Others thought maybe he was just getting old, wanted privacy. She looked at Dan carefully. Whatever was eating at him, it ate at him for a long time. I saw him about 6 months before he died, at the pharmacy. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. Dan thought about that conversation all through Friday. On Saturday morning, he and Aaron loaded up the truck, cleaning supplies, trash bags, work gloves, a cooler with sandwiches and water. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through pine forests and past old farms until they turned onto a private road that hadn't been maintained in years. The house appeared suddenly through the trees, and Dan's breath caught. It was stunning, even in decay. All angles and glass, built into the hillside, so it seemed to grow out of the landscape. Walter had designed it himself in 1968, and it looked like the future people had imagined back. Then clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, a flat roof with dramatic overhangs. The glass was clouded with grime, the wood siding weathered grey, but the bones were magnificent. "Wow," Aaron said softly. "I had no idea." Dan parked, and they sat for a moment, just looking. Then he pulled out the keys Hugh Penbrook had given him, 2 brass keys worn smooth with age, attached to a leather fob with Walter's initials embossed in fading gold. The door opened with resistance, hinges protesting. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating a space frozen in time. The furniture was covered with white sheets that had yellowed. The floor was original terrazzo, dulled but intact. Built-in shelving held books and objects Dan couldn't quite make out in the dim light. It's like a museum, Aaron said, his voice hushed. Like he just walked out one day and never came back. But Walter had come back. He'd lived here until his death. He'd walked these floors, slept in that bedroom visible through the doorway, sat in chairs now hidden beneath sheets. He'd lived here alone with whatever had changed him in 1982, whatever weight Lorraine had seen him carrying. Dan pulled off the first sheet, revealing a low-slung sofa in burnt orange fabric, sun-bleached along the top. Dust filled the air, making him cough. They worked for 2 hours, removing sheets, opening windows to air the place out, taking stock. The house was remarkably preserved, no water damage, no mold, just dust and time. Walter's belongings were everywhere. Books on architecture and history, vinyl records, mid-century pottery, framed photographs of buildings he'd designed. And then, as Dan pulled a paint-stained blanket from between 2 covered sofas near the fireplace, he saw it. A wooden crate, military green, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was heavy, he could tell just by looking at the way it sat firmly on the floor, not budging when the blanket came away. "What's that?" Aaron had come up beside him. "I don't know." Dan knelt down, his knee protesting. The crate had a hinged lid with a simple clasp, no lock. Stamped on the side in faded black stencil, "Property of U.S. Government," followed by a serial number. He opened it. The gold bars lay in neat rows, 12 of them, each about the size of a brick. They gleamed even in the dusty light, stamped with official-looking marks and numbers. Dan reached out, touched one, felt its weight and coldness. "Dad," Aaron whispered, "is that real?" Dan lifted one bar. It was astonishingly heavy, dense in a way that couldn't be faked. The stamp read, 1 kilo, 999 fine gold, followed by a serial number and what looked like an official seal. His hands were shaking. "I think so," he said. "I think it's very real." Dan couldn't stop staring at the gold bars. They sat in their crate like something from a dream or a nightmare. He'd seen gold before, of course, in jewelry stores and museums, but never like this. Never 12 solid kilograms of it stacked neatly in a military surplus box in his dead grandfather's living room. "Should we touch them?" Aaron had moved closer, his face a mixture of wonder and concern. "I already did." Dan's voice sounded strange to his own ears. "They're real, Aaron. I can feel it. The weight, the density, you can't fake that." He lifted another bar, turning it over in his hands. The stamps were crisp, official. Each bar bore slightly different serial numbers, but the same government markings. These weren't black market goods or smuggled treasures. These were legitimate bars, purchased through proper channels, stamped and certified, which made their presence here even more confusing. "How much is gold worth?" Aaron asked. Dan's mind was already doing the math. "Last I checked, something like $60 a gram. These are kilogram bars, so—" He paused, calculating. "Each one is worth maybe $60,000, maybe more, times 12. Times 12. Dan set the bar back carefully in its place. His heart was hammering. $700,000, maybe more, sitting in a box in an abandoned house for 20 years. Aaron lowered himself carefully onto the dusty sofa. Why would Grandpa Walter have this much gold? "I don't know." Dan closed the crate lid, then immediately opened it again, as if he needed to confirm the bars were still there. "I don't know anything about this. Maybe he was saving it, like an investment. Maybe." But something felt wrong about that explanation. If Walter had been investing in gold, why hide it like this? Why not keep it in a safe deposit box at a bank? Why store it in a military crate under a blanket between 2 sofas? Dan pulled out his phone, snapped several photographs of the bars, the serial numbers, the stamps. The light wasn't great, but the images were clear enough. Evidence, documentation. He wasn't sure why he felt the need for evidence, but Some instinct told him this discovery needed to be recorded. "What are we going to do?" Aaron's question hung in the dusty air. Dan sat down beside his son, the springs of the old sofa creaking under his weight. "I don't know that either. We could report it, tell the police, or I don't know, the government. And say what? We found gold in my grandfather's house? It's not stolen property as far as we know. It's not illegal to own gold." Dan rubbed his face with both hands. "But where did it come from? That's what I need to know." Aaron was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "What would we do with that much money?" The question settled over Dan like a weight. What would they do? Pay off debts, certainly. Aaron's medical expenses were mounting. Denise's checks covered some of it, but not all. There were procedures Aaron needed, equipment that would make his life easier, therapies that insurance wouldn't cover. Dan's truck was dying, the transmission slipping more each week. The rent was always tight, always due too soon. $700,000 would change everything. "A lot," Dan said finally. "We could do a lot." "But where did it come from, Dad?" Aaron turned to look at his father. "That matters, doesn't it?" Dan met his son's eyes and saw something there that made his chest tight, a moral clarity, a simple understanding that some questions had to be answered before any decisions could be made. Aaron had always had that quality, even as a child. A sense of right and wrong that was uncomplicated by the compromises adults learned to make. "Yeah," Dan said. "It matters." They spent the next hour searching the living room more carefully. Dan moved methodically, checking under furniture, behind bookshelves, inside cabinets. If Walter had hidden one thing, he might have hidden others. But they found nothing else unusual, just the accumulated possessions of a long life lived alone. "We should check the rest of the house," Aaron suggested. They moved through the bedrooms, Walter's sparse and orderly, a guest room that looked untouched for decades. The bathroom with its pink tile and fixtures from another era. Everything was dated but clean, as if Walter had maintained the house fastidiously even as he withdrew from the world outside. In what had clearly been Walter's office, Dan stopped. Here was evidence of the man's professional life: filing cabinets, a desk with an old typewriter, bookshelves crammed with architectural journals and reference books. A drafting table stood by the window, its surface still bearing the faint impressions of pencil marks from drawings long since removed. Dan opened the filing cabinets. Manila folders, neatly labeled, containing what looked like business correspondence, contracts, project files. He pulled out a folder at random: blueprints for a government facility in Nevada, dated 1974. Another folder held correspondence with the Department of Defense, discussing specifications for a secure communications building. "He did a lot of government work," Aaron observed, looking over Dan's shoulder. "Cold War era. There was a lot of military construction back then." Dan flipped through more folders, his contractor's eye automatically noting the scope and complexity of the projects. Walter had been more than just competent. These were sophisticated designs, technically advanced for their time. At the back of the bottom drawer, Dan found a sealed cardboard tube, the kind used to store rolled blueprints. He pulled it out, noting its weight. The cap was sealed with yellowed tape that cracked when he twisted it. Inside were blueprints, but also something else, a manila envelope, unsealed. Dan slid it out and opened it carefully. Inside were more documents, contracts, payment schedules, letters on official letterhead. He spread them across the desk, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Project Coldbrook," Aaron read aloud from one document. "What's that? Some kind of government contract?" Dan scanned the pages, catching fragments. "Infrastructure development, secure facilities, Nevada and New Mexico locations. Dates ranging from 1978 to 1981. And then, stamped across several pages in red ink, classified. His mouth went dry. "Dad, should we be looking at this? It's 20 years old, 40 years old, some of it. Whatever classification it had is probably expired. But Dan's hands were shaking slightly as he continued reading. One letter, dated March 1981, caught his attention. It was addressed to Walter from someone named Karl Metzger, a name that appeared frequently in the project documents. The tone was casual, friendly even, discussing timelines and specifications. But there was a line near the end that made Dan pause. The special compensation package we discussed should process through the usual channels by month's end. As always, your discretion is appreciated. Special compensation. Dan looked back at the living room, toward where the crate of gold bars sat hidden between the sofas. We need to keep looking, he said quietly. We need to understand what Walter was involved in. Aaron nodded, his expression serious. They'd come to clean out an old house. They'd found something else entirely, a mystery that reached back decades, and a fortune that might come with strings attached. Dan carefully photographed each document before returning them to the envelope. Then he and Aaron continued their search, moving through the house with new purpose, looking for answers to questions they hadn't known to ask when they'd arrived that morning. Outside, the afternoon sun filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across Walter's modernist house. Inside, father and son worked in silence, uncovering piece by piece the hidden life of a man they'd thought they knew, and discovering that family secrets could lie dormant for decades, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Dan didn't sleep well that night. He and Aaron had locked up the house at dusk, leaving everything as they'd found it, including the gold. The drive home had been mostly silent, both of them lost in thought. Now, at 2 in the morning, Dan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over the discovery again and again. $700,000, maybe more, depending on current gold prices. Money that could solve every practical problem in his life. Money that came from somewhere, for some reason, and sat hidden in his grandfather's house for 2 decades. Special compensation. What did that mean? He got up, moved quietly to the kitchen, and made coffee, even though he knew it would only make sleep more impossible. His phone sat on the counter, and after a moment's hesitation, he opened the browser and typed, Project Coldbrook Government, 1,980 seconds. Nothing useful came up. A few random references to cold-related research, a brook in Vermont, nothing about classified government. Infrastructure. He tried Karl Metzger, architect, Cold War. More results this time. An obituary from 1995. Karl Metzger, age 67, died unexpectedly. Survived by a sister, no children mentioned. Former principal at Metzger and Associates, architectural firm specializing in government contracts. The obituary was brief, perfunctory, the kind that revealed nothing about the actual person. Dan kept searching, following threads through old newspaper archives and public records databases. Karl Metzger's firm had dissolved in 1982, the same year Lorraine said Walter had changed. That couldn't be coincidence. He found a reference in a 1981 newspaper, a small item about a construction accident at a government facility in New Mexico. 3 workers killed when scaffolding collapsed. The article mentioned the contractor by name, Metzger and Associates. An investigation was pending. Dan read the article 3 times, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. When Aaron shuffled into the kitchen at 6, Dan was still at the table, surrounded by printouts and notes. "You've been up all night." It wasn't a question. Couldn't sleep. Dan poured coffee for his son. "Aaron, I think I found something, or the beginning of something." He explained what he'd discovered, the accident, the timing, Karl Metzger's death 14 years later. Aaron listened, his face serious. "You think the gold is connected to the accident?" "I don't know. But the timing matches when Walter changed, when Lorraine said he withdrew from everything." Dan tapped the obituary. "And this Metzger died unexpectedly. No details. That could mean anything, or nothing. People die, Dad. Sometimes there's no mystery. I know, but I have to find out. Dan gathered the papers. I'm going back to the house today. There has to be more documents, more clues, something that explains this. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know you have that physical therapy appointment. Aaron shook his head. I'll reschedule. This is important. They arrived at Walter's house by 9, the morning sun making the glass walls gleam. Dan felt different approaching it this time, less like he was visiting a relic and more like he was investigating a crime scene, though what crime, he couldn't say. Inside, they went straight to the office. Dan worked systematically through the filing cabinets while Aaron searched the desk drawers. Hours passed in focused silence, broken only by the occasional observation. Here's another Project Coldbrook reference, Aaron said, holding up a folder. Payment schedule from 1,980. Looks like Walter's firm got monthly installments, but there are also these separate line items marked consulting fees. Dan took the document. The consulting fees were substantial, tens of thousands of dollars, paid quarterly, separate from the main contract payments. No explanation of what the consulting actually entailed. That's a lot of money for consulting, Dan muttered. In another drawer, he found correspondence between Walter and various government officials. Mundane stuff, mostly technical specifications and timeline discussions. But one letter, tucked into a folder marked personal, was different. It was handwritten, dated December 1981, from someone named Phyllis Granger. Mr. Keller, I am writing to you one final time. It has been 8 months since my father died at the Project Coldbrook site, and still no one will give our family straight answers. The investigation called it an accident, but my father was a careful man, a professional with 20 years of experience. He would not have made the mistakes they claim he made. I know you were there. I know you saw what happened. Please, if you have any conscience at all, tell the truth about what went wrong that day. 3 families deserve answers. My father deserves justice. Please. Dan read the letter twice, then handed it to Aaron. She thinks Walter knew something, Aaron said quietly. She thinks the accident wasn't really an accident, or that it was preventable, that someone cut corners, ignored safety protocols. Dan felt sick, and she thinks Walter covered it up. They kept searching, and the picture that emerged was troubling. More letters from families, Tommy Hartwick's widow, Jude Brennan's brother, all asking the same questions, all hitting the same wall of official silence. The investigation had ruled it an accident, case closed. Dan found a newspaper clipping from 3 months after the accident. A small article noting that the Project Coldbrook facility had been completed on schedule, despite the tragedy. The final paragraph mentioned that 2 key contractors, Carl Metzger and Walter Keller, had announced their retirement from government work, effective immediately. Retirement. At the height of their careers. Right after 3 men died and families were asking uncomfortable questions. Dad, look at this. Aaron had opened a lower desk drawer, one Dan had missed. Inside was a small metal lockbox, the key still in the lock. Dan opened it. Inside were bank statements from the early 1982, Walter's personal accounts. The deposits matched what Dan had seen in the project files, but starting in April 1981, 1 month after the letter from Phyllis Granger, there were additional deposits, large ones, $50,000, then another $50,000, then monthly deposits of $10,000, continuing for 2 years, and stapled to one statement, a receipt, purchase of investment-grade gold bullion, 2 kilograms, $999 fine. The first purchase. Dan checked the dates on subsequent statements, more gold purchases every few months, always 2 kilograms at a time. Over 3 years, Walter had converted hundreds of thousands of dollars into gold bars. He was being paid off, Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. Paid to stay quiet about what really happened. Dan wanted to argue, to find another explanation, but the evidence was too clear. The timeline, the amounts, the abrupt retirement, the family's unanswered letters, it all pointed to the same conclusion. His grandfather had been involved in something that got 3 men killed. He'd been paid to keep silent, and he'd spent that blood money on gold, hidden it away like it burned his hands to touch it. "What do we do?" Aaron asked. Dan looked at his son, saw the same moral clarity he'd seen the day before. Some questions mattered, some truths couldn't be ignored, no matter how uncomfortable. "We find those families," Dan said. "We find out what really happened, and then—" He paused, thinking of the gold bars sitting in the other room. "Then we figure out how to make this right." Dan spent the next week researching, and what he found only deepened the mystery. The accident at Project Coldbrook had killed 3 experienced construction workers, Tommy Hartwick, Jude Brennan, and Phyllis Granger's father, whose name was Gordon. All 3 had been working on specialized infrastructure when scaffolding collapsed. The official report blamed faulty equipment and human error, but the families had never accepted that conclusion. Dan found old forum posts archived from construction industry message boards in the early days of the internet. Family members asking questions, sharing suspicions, wondering why the investigation had closed so quickly, why no one was held accountable, why the contractors had suddenly retired. On Thursday afternoon, Dan made a decision. He looked up Phyllis Granger in the White Pages database. There were 3 listings in New Mexico. He started calling. The second number reached her. "Hello?" The voice was older, cautious. "Miss Granger? My name is Dan Keller. I'm Walter Keller's grandson." Silence on the line. Then, "I see. I found your letter, the one you wrote to my grandfather in 1981. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know." Dan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think he wanted to tell the truth. I think he was prevented from doing it." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Her voice was sharp, bitter. "Your grandfather knew what happened to my father. He could have spoken up. Instead, he took his money and retired to his fancy house in the woods. I know, and I can't excuse that. But I'm trying to understand what happened, and I thought maybe you could tell me what you remember." Another long pause. "Why does it matter now? They're all dead. My father, your grandfather, Karl Metzger. Everyone who knew the truth is gone. Not everyone. You're still here. The other families are still here. And I found—" Dan stopped himself. He wasn't ready to mention the gold yet. "I found documents that suggest my grandfather was paid to stay silent. A lot of money." He heard her draw a sharp breath. "I knew it. We all knew it, but we couldn't prove anything. Tell me what you remember, please." Phyllis was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, worn down by years of unanswered questions. "My father was a foreman, 20 years of experience, never a safety violation. He called me 2 days before the accident, said something wasn't right on the site. The concrete wasn't curing properly, the scaffolding system they were using wasn't rated for the load. He'd filed complaints, but Metzger and your grandfather overruled him. Said they were behind schedule, over budget, had to push forward." Dan closed his eyes, picturing it. "Dad said he was going to refuse to continue unless they fixed the problems. That was on a Tuesday. Thursday morning the scaffolding collapsed. Dad and 2 other men fell 4 stories. They died before the ambulance arrived." "I'm sorry," Dan said quietly. "The investigation was a joke. They interviewed workers, but everyone was scared of being blacklisted. The official report blamed my father, said he'd miscalculated load distribution. But Dad didn't miscalculate anything. He was the one trying to stop the work until it was safe." "What about the other families? Tommy Hartwick and Jude Brennan. Do you know if they believe the official story?" "Tommy's wife died 10 years ago. Broken heart, really. But Jude's brother, he's still around. Preston Brennan. Lives in Arizona now. Works as a safety inspector, if you can believe that." Jude's death changed his whole life. Dan wrote down the name. Did you ever hear from my grandfather after that letter you wrote? No, nothing. I wrote 3 times. Never got a reply. She paused. What exactly did you find, Mr. Keller? Dan chose his words carefully. Evidence that my grandfather received substantial payments after the accident, payments that weren't part of his normal contract, and evidence that it weighed on him for the rest of his life. Good. I hope it kept him up at night. I think it did. Dan thought of the house, frozen in time, Walter living there alone for decades. Miss Granger, if there was a way to acknowledge what happened, to make some kind of amends, would that matter to you? Amends? How do you make amends for my father's death? I don't know. But my grandfather left something behind, and I think he meant for it to be used to set things right. I'm still figuring out what that means, but I want to try. Phyllis was quiet for a long time. My father was a good man. He deserved better than to be blamed for his own death. If you can clear his name somehow, if you can tell the truth about what really happened, that would matter. That would matter more than anything. After they hung up, Dan sat staring at his notes. Aaron came in, saw his father's face. Bad conversation? Necessary conversation. Dan explained what Phyllis had told him. Walter knew those men died because of decisions he and Metzger made. He knew it was their fault, and he stayed silent. For money. For money. And maybe for his reputation, his career. Or maybe he was threatened, we don't know that part yet. Dan rubbed his face. But he kept that money, Aaron. Converted it to gold, and hid it like he couldn't bear to spend it. Because spending it would mean accepting it, Aaron said thoughtfully. Keeping it as gold meant it wasn't real yet, wasn't really his. Dan looked at his son with new appreciation. That's exactly right. So what now? Now I call Preston Brennan, and I keep looking for answers. And I figure out how to use that gold the way Walter should have used it 30 years ago. Dan stood, determination settling over him. Those families never got justice. Maybe they can at least get acknowledgement. Maybe they can know their loved ones didn't die because of their own mistakes. And the money? Dan thought about that. I don't know yet. But I know it's not mine to keep. Preston Brennan answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was gruff, weathered by years of sun and wind. Mr. Brennan, my name is Dan Keller. I'm Walter Keller's grandson. A sharp intake of breath. What do you want? I want to know about my grandfather, about what happened at Project Coldbrook in 1981. I know your brother Jude died there, and I think my grandfather knew more than he ever said. You think? Preston's laugh was harsh. Your grandfather and Metzger knew exactly what happened. They cut corners, pushed deadlines, ignored safety warnings. My brother paid for it with his life. I'm trying to understand this. Jude was 32 years old, had a wife, 2 kids. He was working double shifts to make foreman, trying to provide for his family. The day before he died, he told me the site wasn't safe. Said the scaffolding system was wrong for the job, that they were overloading it. Dan's hand tightened on the phone. Did he report it? To Gordon Granger, the foreman. Gordon went to management, got overruled. Then Gordon and Jude and Tommy Hartwick all died the next day when that scaffolding came down like a house of cards. Preston's voice cracked. 3 good men dead because someone wanted to save money and meet a deadline. The investigation was bought and paid for. I know it. You know it. Everybody who was there knew it. But nobody could prove it. Workers were too scared to talk. Documents disappeared. And your grandfather and Metzger retired rich men while we buried our dead. Dan closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't help his kids who grew up without a father. Preston paused. Why are you calling now? Walter's been dead for years. Because I found something. Evidence that he was paid to stay quiet. And I think he regretted it. I think he wanted to make it right, but didn't know how. Too little, too late. I know, but I want to try to finish what he should have done. Preston was silent for a long moment. What kind of evidence? Dan explained about the bank statements, the payments, the gold purchases. As he talked, he could hear Preston's breathing change. How much? Preston asked finally. Close to $750,000. In today's value, maybe more. A long, heavy silence. Then Preston said, "Blood money." "Yes. What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet. But I know it doesn't belong to me. It never belonged to Walter. Not really. He was just holding it." "For what? His conscience?" Preston's voice was bitter. "Did it help him sleep at night?" "I don't think he slept much. The house, it's like he stopped living after 1981. Just existed there, alone, surrounded by his guilt." "Good." But Preston's voice had lost some of its edge. "Look, Mr. Keller, I appreciate the call. I do. But talking about it doesn't change anything. My brother's still dead, his kids still grew up without him, and that money, however much it is, it won't bring him back. No. But maybe it could help his family. Help all the families. His wife remarried, moved on. His kids are grown now, have their own lives. They don't need charity. From the man who got their father killed. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was restitution? What if it came with the truth about what really happened?" Preston went quiet. Dan could hear him breathing, thinking. "The truth," Preston said finally. "That's what we wanted back then. That's what the investigation should have given us. Instead, they blamed the victims and called it closed. If I could find a way to tell that truth, to document what really happened, to clear your brother's name, and Gordon's and Tommy's, would that matter? You can't undo the official record. That report is on file somewhere, blaming them for their own deaths. But I could tell the real story. I have documents, bank statements, evidence of the payoff. I could show that safety concerns were raised and ignored, that Walter and Metzger knew the risks and pushed forward anyway. To what end? The truth. For its own sake, and for their families to know their loved ones weren't at fault." Preston was quiet for so long Dan thought he'd hung up. Then, "Tommy Hartwick's widow died, but he had a sister, lives in Nevada still. And Gordon Granger's daughter, you probably found her already. I spoke with Phyllis yesterday. Then you know how much it would mean to her. She spent years trying to clear her father's name." Preston sighed, and the sound was heavy with old pain. "Look, I became a safety inspector because of what happened to Jude. Spent my whole career making sure other workers didn't die from preventable accidents. If you can do something, anything, to acknowledge that Jude and Gordon and Tommy died because someone else's greed, not their own mistakes, yeah, that would matter." After they hung up, Dan sat with his notes, the weight of 3 lives pressing down on him. 3 men with families, with futures, with children who'd grown up without fathers, all because schedules mattered more than safety, all because speaking up would have cost Walter his career and reputation. And Walter had taken the money and converted it to gold, as if by not spending it he could pretend it wasn't real, as if hiding it away could make the guilt hurt less. But guilt didn't work that way. Dan understood that now. Walter had lived with it for 20 years after the accident, another 15 after Carl Metzger's suspicious death. He'd lived alone in his glass house, surrounded by the weight of what he'd done and the fortune he'd been paid to stay silent. Now, Dan had inherited both, the fortune and the burden. Dan returned to the house on Monday, this time alone. Aaron had a medical appointment, and besides, Dan needed space to think. He'd been avoiding the basement. It was dark, musty, the kind of space that looked forgotten. But something Preston had said kept nagging at him. Documents disappeared. If documents had disappeared from the official investigation, maybe Walter had kept copies. Maybe there was more evidence hidden in the house. The basement stairs creaked under his weight. He flipped the light switch, and a single bulb flickered on, casting harsh shadows across concrete walls and exposed ceiling joists. Boxes were stacked along one wall, labeled in Walter's precise handwriting. Tax records 1975 to 1980. Project files. Personal correspondence. Dan started with the project files, methodically going through each box. Most contained mundane construction documents, blueprints, material orders, inspection reports. Nothing about Project Colebrook. Then he noticed something odd. The boxes were labeled chronologically, but there was a gap. Files from 1978 to 1979, then nothing until 1983. The years of Project Colebrook and its aftermath were missing. Dan looked around the basement more carefully. In the far corner, behind an old water heater, he saw what looked like a panel in the wall. He moved closer, running his fingers along the edge. It wasn't flush with the surrounding concrete. He pushed, and the panel shifted. Behind it was a shallow space, maybe 6 inches deep, carved into the foundation wall. And inside that space was a wooden crate, smaller than the one containing the gold, but similar in style. Dan's heart hammered as he pulled it out. The crate was lighter, but when he opened it, his breath caught. Cassette tapes. Dozens of them, each labeled with dates from 1981 and 1982. Beneath the tapes were files, thick manila folders bulging with documents. Dan pulled out the first folder. Inside were photocopies of safety reports, each one marked with red ink, attention required and immediate action needed. The reports detailed structural concerns, improper scaffolding, concrete that wasn't meeting specifications. Each report was signed by Gordon Granger and submitted to project management, and each one had been stamped, reviewed, and dismissed in Walter's handwriting. Dan's hands shook as he flipped through page after page. Gordon had documented everything. He'd raised every concern, followed every protocol, done everything right. And Walter and Metzger had overruled him every time, citing budget constraints and schedule pressures. The last report was dated 2 days before the accident. Gordon's handwriting was urgent, almost desperate. Critical safety failure imminent. Scaffolding system inadequate for current load. Concrete pillars show stress fractures. Recommend immediate work stoppage pending structural review. Walter's response, written in the margin, schedule non-negotiable. Proceed as planned. Dan felt sick. He picked up one of the cassette tapes. The label read, the 15th of March, 1981, site meeting. 3 days before the accident. Dan searched the basement until he found an old cassette player on a shelf. He plugged it in, inserted the tape, and pressed play. The sound quality was poor, tinny, but the voices were clear enough. Walter's voice, younger but recognizable. Gentlemen, we're 3 weeks behind schedule and 40,000 over budget. We need to accelerate. Another, voice harder. That's Metzger, Dan thought. Then Gordon Granger's voice, calm but firm. Mr. Keller, Mr. Metzger, I've submitted 3 reports this week alone. The scaffolding system isn't safe. We've got stress fractures in the support columns. If we add more load, Metzger, cut him off. The engineering specs say it's fine. The engineering specs are wrong. I'm telling you, from 20 years of experience, this setup won't hold. Walter's voice. Gordon, we appreciate your concerns, but we've had the calculations reviewed. The system is adequate. It's not, and if something happens, nothing's going to happen. Metzger again, dismissive. You're being overcautious. 3 men are working that scaffolding every day. Their lives depend on it being safe. A pause. Then Walter's voice, quieter, almost uncomfortable. We've noted your concerns in the record, but the schedule stands. We proceed tomorrow as planned. The tape, continued more argument, Gordon pressing his case, Walter and Metzger remaining firm. Finally, Gordon's voice resigned. I want it noted that I recommended work stoppage. When something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, I want it on record that I tried to stop it. Noted, Walter said. The tape ended. Dan sat in the silent basement, understanding washing over him in cold waves. Walter hadn't just accepted a payoff after the accident. He'd known beforehand. He'd been warned, explicitly, by a man with 20 years of experience, and he'd ignored those warnings because of schedule and budget. And then, when those 3 men died exactly as Gordon predicted, Walter had taken money to stay silent about his own culpability. Dan went through more tapes. One recorded the immediate aftermath of the accident chaos. Sirens, Metzger's voice saying, "Stick to the plan, blame equipment failure." Another tape, dated 2 weeks later, captured a private conversation between Walter and Metzger. The families are asking questions. Walter's voice, strained. Let them ask. The official report will settle it. We knew, Carl, Gordon warned us. We have it on record. We have nothing. Those reports disappeared, remember? As far as anyone knows, Gordon never raised concerns. This was an unfortunate accident caused by equipment failure and human error. His error, you mean? You're going to blame Gordon for his own death. I'm going to protect us both, and you're going to accept the consulting fees we discussed and keep your mouth shut, unless you want your career destroyed and potential criminal charges. A long silence. Then Walter, his voice broken, how much? Enough to make forgetting worthwhile. Dan turned off the tape player. His grandfather hadn't just stayed silent, he'd been complicit from the beginning. The payoff wasn't just hush money. It was compensation for participating in a cover-up, for allowing dead men to be blamed for their own preventable deaths. But Walter had kept the evidence. All of it. The tapes, the reports, the documentation of his own guilt. He'd hidden it away but couldn't destroy it. Because some part of him, Dan realized, had wanted the truth to come out eventually. Had wanted someone, someday, to know what really happened. Dan gathered the files and tapes carefully. This changed everything. This wasn't just about returning blood money to victims' families. This was about revealing the truth, about giving those 3 men back their reputations, about showing their families that they'd been right all along. Dan spread the documents across his kitchen table. Aaron sat across from him, listening to the tapes with headphones, his expression growing darker with each recording. Dad, Aaron said finally, pulling off the headphones. This is evidence of a crime. It was 40 years ago. Statute of limitations has passed. But it proves Gordon and the others weren't at fault. It proves they were killed because of negligence. No, not negligence. Deliberate decisions, made by people who knew better. Dan nodded slowly. The question is what to do with it. You go public. You release these tapes, these documents, you clear their names, and destroy Walter's reputation completely, make our family name synonymous with corporate greed and cover-ups. Aaron met his father's eyes. Does that matter more than the truth? Dan looked at his son, 28 years old, navigating life with challenges that would have broken most people, and still somehow the most morally clear person Dan had ever known. No, Dan said quietly. It doesn't. But it wasn't that simple, and Dan knew it. Going public meant exposure. It meant reporters, questions, scrutiny. It meant the gold would be discovered, and then there would be legal questions about inheritance, taxes, whether Dan had any right to it at all. It meant dragging up a 40-year-old tragedy and reopening wounds that had scarred over, if not healed. I need to talk to someone, Dan said. Someone who can advise me on how to do this right. The next morning, Dan sat in Hugh Penbrook's office. The estate lawyer was in his 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on his nose. He'd been handling Walter's estate for years, navigating the complicated probate process. Dan, good to see you. How's the house cleanup going? Complicated. Dan set his briefcase on the desk. Hugh, I need legal advice. Not as my grandfather's estate lawyer, but as my personal attorney. Can we have that kind of conversation? Hugh's expression shifted, became more careful. What kind of situation are we talking about? The kind where I found evidence of a crime my grandfather committed 40 years ago, along with evidence he was paid substantial amounts to stay silent about it. And I need to know how to handle it without destroying my life or my son's future. Hugh was quiet for a long moment. I think you'd better tell me everything. Dan did. He explained the gold, the documents, the tapes, the 3 dead workers, and the families that never got answers. He explained the timeline, the payoffs, Karl Metzger's role. He left nothing out. When Dan finished, Hugh sat back in his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. This is quite a situation. I know. The gold is legally yours. It was your grandfather's property, purchased legally, part of his estate. How he acquired the money to buy it is morally problematic, but not legally relevant at this point. So I can keep it. Legally, yes. Should you? Hugh put his glasses back on, studying Dan. That's a different question entirely. The families deserve something, some acknowledgement of what happened, what was taken from them. Agreed, but you need to be careful about how you approach this. If you go public with accusations of a cover-up, even with evidence, you could face defamation lawsuits from Metzger's estate or others involved. The statute of limitations protects you from criminal charges, but civil liability is different. Dan hadn't considered that. So what do I do? Hugh thought for a moment. You could create a trust. Anonymous distributions to the families, structured as, let's say, memorial gifts or charitable donations. No explanations, no accusations, just financial support. That feels like another cover-up, like I'm paying them off to stay quiet, just like Walter was paid. Then you tell them the truth privately. You contact each family, share the evidence, let them decide what to do with it. You give them the power Walter took away from them. Dan considered that. And the gold? Convert it to cash, establish the trust, distribute the funds. I can help you structure it properly, handle the legal paperwork. It'll take time. Liquidating that much gold quietly isn't simple, but it can be done. How long? A few months, if we're careful. We'll need to work with reputable dealers, provide documentation of legitimate ownership. The tax implications will be significant but manageable. Dan thought about Aaron's medical bills, about his dying truck, about rent always coming due, a few months of knowing the money existed but not being able to touch it, a few months of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. Do it, Dan said. Set up the trust. I want equal distributions to the 3 families, Gordon Granger's daughter Phyllis, Jude Brennan's brother Preston, and Tommy Hartwick's sister. Can you find Tommy's sister? I'll need to do some research, but yes. If she's still alive, I can find her. And I want to meet with each of them if they're willing. I want to give them the evidence. Let them know what really happened. They deserve the truth from someone in my family, even if it comes 40 years too late. Hugh made notes. This is going to take time, Dan, and it's going to be emotionally difficult. Are you prepared for that? Dan thought about Walter, living alone in that glass house for 20 years with the weight of 3 deaths and a fortune in blood money. He thought about Phyllis Granger's unanswered letters, about Preston becoming a safety inspector because his brother died preventably, about children who grew up without fathers because budget and schedule mattered more than lives. I'm prepared, Dan said. My grandfather ran from this for 40 years. I'm not going to run anymore. As Dan left Hugh's office, his phone rang. It was Denise, his ex-wife. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Dan, it's about Aaron's medical expenses. The insurance denied the appeal. We're looking at another $12,000 in bills. Dan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of it. $12,000. A fraction of what sat in gold bars in Walter's house. Money he could access now, if he wanted. If he kept one bar, just one, no one would know. I'll handle it, Dan said. How? Dan, we're already behind. I said I'll handle it. His voice was firmer than he felt. Give me 2 weeks. He hung up and sat in his truck, hands on the steering wheel. 2 weeks to figure out how to cover Aaron's bills without touching the gold. 2 weeks to prove to himself he meant what he'd told Hugh. Some inheritances were curses, but maybe, just maybe, they were also opportunities to be better than the people who left them behind. Dan sold his truck on Wednesday. It wasn't an easy decision. The truck was 20 years old, needed transmission work, but it was his. He'd bought it when Aaron was 10, back when he was still married and work was steady. It had hauled lumber and tools to hundreds of job sites. It had the dent in the passenger door from when Aaron had accidentally closed it on a shovel, and the coffee stain on the center console that had never quite come out. But it was worth $8,000 to a local dealer who needed work trucks. Combined with what Dan had in savings, it was enough to cover Aaron's medical bills and buy some time. He came home on the bus, carrying his personal items from the truck in a cardboard box. Aaron met him at the door, took one look at his father, and understood. You sold it. Needed to. Dan set the box down. Your medical bills came first. Dad, you need that truck for work. I'll rent one when I need it, or borrow one. It's fine. But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Without his own truck, Dan's already limited work options became even more constrained. But looking at Aaron's face, the guilt and gratitude mixed together, Dan knew he'd made the right choice. I could get a job, Aaron said quietly. I've been looking. Hey, Dan put a hand on his son's shoulder. You focus on your therapy, on getting stronger. The job situation will work itself out. That night, Dan returned to Walter's house. He needed to document everything properly for Hugh, needed to photograph the gold bars individually, record serial numbers, prepare the documentation for liquidation. The house felt different now, less like a time capsule and more like a confession booth. Everywhere Dan looked, he saw evidence of Walter's guilt, the sparse furnishings, the lack of personal warmth, the way the place felt more like a cell than a home. In the bedroom, Dan found something he'd missed before. Walter's nightstand had a locked drawer. Dan tried various keys from the house until one fit. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, its pages filled with Walter's handwriting. Dan sat on the bed and began to read. The early entries were mundane notes about projects, sketches, observations about architecture and design. But after March 1981, the tone changed completely. The 18th of March 1981, 3 men died today. Gordon was right. I knew he was right, and I ignored him. Carl and I pushed forward because the contract penalties for delay were too high, because our reputations were at stake, because we thought we knew better. We didn't. Now, official investigation is underway. Carl insists we destroy Gordon's safety reports, claim he never filed proper concerns. I should refuse. I should tell the truth. God help me, I don't. The 2nd of April, 1981, met with the families today, saw Gordon's daughter Phyllis. She has his eyes. She asked me if her father made a mistake, if he was careless. I told her the investigation would determine what happened. I lied to her face while looking into her father's eyes. The entries continued, chronicling Walter's descent into guilt and self-loathing. The first payoff came in May, and Walter wrote, Carl arranged compensation for our consulting services and discretion. $50,000 deposited today. I stared at the bank statement for an hour. This is the price of 3 lives, apparently. The price of my silence. I can't spend it, can't touch it. converted it to gold instead. If I don't use it, maybe I can pretend it's not real. Entry after entry documented the accumulation of gold, each purchase accompanied by expressions of guilt and self-recrimination. Walter had been tormented by what he'd done, yet he'd never found the courage to make it right. One entry, dated 1995, caught Dan's attention. Carl died yesterday. Heart attack, they say, but I wonder. He'd been drinking heavily, was paranoid in recent years, thought someone was investigating the old projects. Maybe guilt killed him, the way it's been killing me slowly for 15 years. Now I'm the only one left who knows the full truth. The weight is unbearable. The final entries, from shortly before Walter's death, were the most heartbreaking. I'm 83 years old, and I've spent 20 years in this house trying to atone for something that can't be atoned for. I kept the evidence, thinking someday I'd have the courage to release it. I never did. I'm a coward in the end. Perhaps whoever inherits this place will be braver than I was. Perhaps they'll do what I should have done 40 years ago. I can only hope. Dan closed the journal, his hands shaking. Walter had wanted someone to find this. He'd wanted the truth to come out, wanted the families to know, wanted his guilt to finally mean something. I will, Dan whispered to the empty room. I'll do what you couldn't. He spent the rest of the evening photographing everything, the gold bars, the documents, the journal pages. He made copies of the cassette tapes, digitizing them on his laptop. He organized it all methodically, building a complete record of what had happened and what Walter had left behind. Around midnight his phone rang. It was Hugh. Dan, I found Tommy Hartwick's sister. Her name is Frances Hartwick Chen. She's 74, lives in Las Vegas. I spoke with her briefly, told her you wanted to discuss something related to her brother's death. She's willing to meet. That's good. Thank you. There's something else. I've been researching the legal angles. If you go forward with this, releasing the evidence, telling the families everything, you should be prepared for media attention. This kind of story, a 40-year-old cover-up revealed by the perpetrator's grandson, it could get picked up nationally. Dan hadn't thought about that. Does that change anything? It could. For you, for Aaron. People will want to know why you're doing this, whether you're profiting from it. There will be scrutiny. Let them scrutinize. I'm doing the right thing. That's all that matters. Hugh was quiet for a moment. You're a good man, Dan. Better than your grandfather. I don't know about that. I'm just trying not to make the same mistakes. After hanging up, Dan walked through the house one more time. He stopped in front of a photograph on Walter's desk. A young Walter, maybe 30 years old, standing proudly in front of a building he'd designed. His whole career ahead of him, his reputation unblemished, his conscience clear. How had that man become the broken figure? Who'd lived here in isolation for 2 decades? One choice, Dan realized. One decision to prioritize schedule and budget over safety. One moment of choosing reputation over truth. That's all it took. Dan wouldn't make that choice. Whatever it cost him, whatever scrutiny it brought, he would tell the truth. The process of converting gold to cash took 6 weeks. Hugh connected Dan with a reputable precious metals dealer in Denver who specialized in estate liquidations. The dealer asked minimal questions, accepted the purchase receipts from Walter's safe as provenance, and handled everything discreetly. The first sale netted $450,000 after fees and taxes. Dan watched the money transfer into the newly established trust account and felt nothing but relief. It was no longer his burden to carry alone. Hugh had structured the trust carefully, the Walter Keller Memorial Trust, established for the benefit of families affected by construction industry tragedies. It was vague enough to avoid specific accusations, while clear enough in purpose. 3 equal distributions, each for $500,000, would go to Phyllis Granger, Preston Brennan, and Frances Hartwick Chen. But before the money went out, Dan needed to meet with each of them. He needed to give them the evidence, let them know what really happened, and allow them to decide what to do with the truth. Phyllis agreed to meet first. Dan drove to Albuquerque on a Saturday morning, the box of documents and digitized recordings on the seat beside him. They met at a quiet coffee shop on the east side of town. She was 68 now, grey-haired and dignified, with her father's steady gaze. She shook Dan's hand firmly and sat across from him, waiting. "Miss Granger, I want to start by saying my grandfather was wrong. He knew your father was right about the safety concerns, and he ignored him. And then, after your father died, he helped cover it up." Phyllis's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Go on." Dan opened the box and pulled out the copied documents. "These are the safety reports your father filed, every concern documented, every warning recorded. My grandfather dismissed every single one." He watched her hands shake as she read through the reports, saw tears form in her eyes as she recognized her father's handwriting, his urgent warnings, his professional thoroughness. "He tried," she whispered. "He tried to stop it. He did everything right. And he was overruled by men who cared more about deadlines than lives." Dan pulled out the cassette tape transcripts. "These are recordings of meetings before the accident. You can hear your father arguing for safety, for doing things properly. You can hear my grandfather refusing." Phyllis read through the transcripts in silence. When she finished, she looked up at Dan with eyes full of 40 years of vindication and grief. "I knew it. We all knew it, but we couldn't prove it. The official report blamed him," said he. "Miscalculated, made errors. It destroyed his reputation. People thought he was careless, incompetent." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Thank you for this. Thank you for proving we weren't crazy, that we weren't just grieving families looking for someone to blame. There's something else." Dan explained about the gold, about the payoffs, about the trust. "My grandfather converted his guilt into gold bars and hid them away. He couldn't spend them, couldn't give them back, couldn't make himself do the right thing, so I'm doing it for him. The trust will distribute $500,000 to you, to Jude Brennan's brother, and to Tommy Hartwick's sister." Phyllis stared at him. That's too much. I don't want his blood money. It's not about the money. It's about acknowledgement. It's about saying that your father's life mattered, that what happened to him was wrong, and that someone in my family is finally taking responsibility." Dan leaned forward. "Use it however you want. Set up a scholarship in your father's name. Donate it to construction safety organizations. Give it to your children. But please take it, because my grandfather should have given it to you 40 years ago." She was quiet for a long time, tears running down her cheeks. Finally, she nodded. "My father believed in safety. He gave his life trying to protect other workers. I'll use this money to continue that work. I'll establish a fund for construction safety advocacy. Name it after him. The Gordon Granger Safety Initiative." Dan felt something loosen in his chest. He'd be proud of that. "Will you go public with this? The recordings, the documents? That's your decision, not mine. This is your father's vindication. If you want the world to know the truth, I'll support that. If you want to keep it private, I'll respect that." Phyllis touched the documents in front of her. "I need to think about it. Talk to my family. This changes everything I thought I knew about that time. Take your time. You have my number." The meeting with Preston Brennan 2 weeks later in Phoenix went similarly. Preston listened to the recordings with his jaw clenched, rage and grief warring on his weathered face. When Dan explained about the trust, Preston's first instinct was to refuse. "I don't want anything from the people who killed my brother." "Then don't think of it as coming from them. Think of it as restitution, as payment of a debt that was owed for 40 years. Your brother's life had value. This is finally acknowledging that." Preston eventually agreed, saying he'd donate the money to a vocational training program for construction workers, emphasizing safety education. "Jude believed in doing the job right. I'll make sure other workers learn to do the same." Francis Hartwick Chen was the last meeting, and the most emotional. At 74, she'd buried her brother at age 32 and had spent decades wondering if the official story was true. Seeing the evidence, hearing Tommy's safety concerns recorded on tape, broke something open in her. He had a voice, she sobbed. He spoke up, he tried, and they silenced him. Dan sat with her in her Las Vegas apartment, letting her cry, letting her rage, letting 40 years of doubt and confusion finally have clarity. "The money," she said finally. "I have grandchildren, Tommy's nephews and nieces who never met him. Can I set up education funds for them? Let Tommy help raise another generation even though he's gone?" "That's a beautiful idea," Dan said. When he left Francis's apartment, Dan sat in his rental car and called Aaron. "How did it go?" his son asked. "They know now. They finally know the truth. And the money? Going to good causes. Gordon's name will be on a safety initiative. Jude's memory will train future workers. Tommy will help educate his family's next generation." Dan started the car. "Walter's blood money is becoming something worthwhile. You did good, Dad." Dan drove through the desert night, heading home, feeling lighter than he had in months. 3 months after the first distribution, Dan stood at Walter's grave for the first time in 20 years. It was a simple headstone in a quiet cemetery, nothing grand or showy, just a name, dates, and the word architect carved beneath. He'd come alone. Aaron had offered to join him, but this felt like something Dan needed to do by himself. "I found it all," Dan said to the stone, feeling foolish talking to granite, but needing to say the words anyway. "The gold, the documents, the recordings. I found your journal too. Read every word of how much you regretted what you did." A breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of nearby oak trees. "I gave it back. Well, not back exactly. Those 3 men can't be brought back. But I gave it to their families. Phyllis is starting a safety organization in her father's name. Preston's funding training programs for construction workers. Francis is sending her grandkids to college on Tommy's behalf." Dan's throat tightened. "You should have done it yourself, but at least it's done now." He stood there for a while longer, thinking about legacy and choices and the weight that silence carries across generations. Then he drove to Walter's house one final time. The new owners were moving in next week, a young family with 2 children, excited about the modernist architecture and the woods surrounding the property. Dan had sold it for less than market value, wanting it to go to people who would fill it with life and warmth, who would chase away the ghosts of isolation and guilt. He walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on the terrazzo floors. Most of Walter's belongings had been donated or discarded. Dan had kept only a few things, some photographs, the journal, and one item he'd found during the final cleanup. In Walter's bedroom closet, behind a row of suits that still smelled faintly of mothballs, Dan had discovered a pocket watch. It was simple, silver, with an inscription on the inside of the case, "Time reveals all truth." Below that, in smaller script, "To Walter, from your father, 1952. Dan held it now, feeling its weight in his palm. A family heirloom passed from Walter's father to Walter, carried daily for decades, then abandoned in a closet sometime after 1981. As if Walter couldn't bear to carry it anymore, couldn't face the inscription's promise every time he checked the time. Time reveals all truth. Eventually, Dan pocketed the watch and continued through the house. In the living room, where he'd found the gold 3 months ago, he paused. The space looked different. Empty, larger, more open, full of possibility instead of buried secrets. His phone buzzed. A text from Phyllis. "Wanted you to know, filed the paperwork today. The Gordon Granger Safety Initiative is official. First grant goes out next month to fund safety inspections at small construction sites. Thank you for making this possible." Then Preston. Training program launches in 2 weeks, 12 students enrolled, all learning safety protocols and proper procedures. Jude would have liked knowing his death meant something in the end. And Francis, 3 grandkids got their first semester scholarships. Couldn't have done it without you. Tommy's legacy lives on. Dan read each message twice, feeling the weight he'd been carrying for months finally lift. This was what inheritance should be, not gold hidden in darkness, but light passed forward, transforming pain into purpose. He locked the house for the last time and drove home. Aaron was at the kitchen table when Dan arrived, working on a laptop. He looked up, smiled. "How'd it go?" "Good." Said goodbye to the house, to Walter. Felt like closure. Dan sat down across from his son. Got messages from all 3 families, the money's being put to good use. "And the last gold bar? The one Hugh said you kept?" Dan had kept 1 bar, at Hugh's suggestion, not for wealth, but as a reminder. It sat now in a safety deposit box at the bank, wrapped in velvet, waiting. It's there, for emergencies, or for you someday, if you really need it. But only if the need is genuine and the use is right. Dan pulled out the pocket watch. "This, though this is the real inheritance." He handed it to Aaron, who turned it over carefully, read the inscription. "Time reveals all truth," Aaron read aloud. That's heavy." "It is, but it's also hopeful, in a way. The truth comes out eventually. Secrets don't stay buried forever, and when they surface, we get to choose what we do with them." Dan leaned back in his chair. "Your great-grandfather gave this to Walter, probably hoping he'd live up to those words. Walter couldn't. But maybe you can. Maybe every generation gets another chance to be better." Aaron held the watch carefully, understanding its significance. "I'll try. I'll do my best. That's all anyone can do." That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He found himself thinking about the past 3 months, the discovery, the investigation, the meetings with families, the liquidation of guilt transformed into gold, then gold transformed into something resembling justice. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could undo what had happened, couldn't bring back 3 men who died because schedule and budget mattered more than safety. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was the truth finally spoken after 40 years of silence. Dan got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He thought about Walter, alone in that glass house for 20 years, carrying his guilt like stones in his pockets. He thought about the families, Phyllis, Preston, Francis, who'd spent decades doubting themselves, wondering if they were wrong to question the official story. And he thought about Aaron, asleep in the next room, carrying that pocket watch's promise into the future. Time reveals all truth. And when it does, the question is what you do. With that revelation, Dan had chosen to honor it, to let the truth reshape what had been hidden, to transform inheritance from a burden into an opportunity for redemption. Not his redemption, Walter was beyond that. But perhaps the redemption of a family name, of a legacy that could be more than silence and secrets. Outside, dawn was beginning to break. A new day, carrying less weight than the one before. 6 months had passed since Dan first opened that wooden crate and found the gold bars that would change everything. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, he sat on the porch of their small rental house, watching leaves spiral down from the oak tree in the front yard. Life had found its rhythm again, a quieter rhythm than before, but steadier somehow, more honest. Aaron came out with 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Dan, and settled into the chair beside him. His movements were easier these days. The new physical therapy program was helping, and without the constant stress of mounting medical bills, he seemed lighter, happier. "Lorraine's coming over for dinner tonight," Aaron said. "She wants to hear about the safety initiative." Dan smiled. Lorraine had become more than a neighbor in these months. She'd been a sounding board, a source of wisdom, someone who'd known Walter and could help Dan understand the man behind the mistakes. She'd told him stories about the Walter she'd known before 1981. Brilliant, engaged, someone who'd cared deeply about his work and his community. It helped, knowing his grandfather hadn't always been the broken figure who'd lived and died in isolation. "The initiative's doing well," Dan said. "Phyllis sent an update yesterday. They've already conducted safety audits at 15 small construction sites, found violations at 8 of them, got them corrected before anyone got hurt. Grandpa Gordon would be proud." Dan nodded. It felt right, calling him that Grandpa Gordon. A man Dan had never met, but whose integrity had echoed across 40 years, preserved in safety reports and desperate warnings that were finally being honored. His phone buzzed. A text from Preston. "Thought you'd want to see this." Below was a photo of 12 young men and women in work gear, standing in front of a banner that read, "Jude Brennan Memorial Safety Training Program Class of 2024. Dan showed the photo to Aaron, and they sat in silence for a moment, looking at faces full of hope and determination. 12 people who would enter the construction industry knowing that safety wasn't negotiable, that speaking up wasn't weakness, that no schedule or budget was worth a human life. "That's Jude's legacy now," Aaron said quietly. "Not the way he died, but what his death is preventing." "Yeah." Dan's voice was rough. "That's exactly right." Another message came through, this time from Francis. "Wanted to share my granddaughter Sarah made Dean's List. First semester of college, and she's thriving. She knows the scholarship is from her great-uncle Tommy, and she says it makes her work harder, knowing he's helping her even though they never met. Thank you for giving Tommy a future, even after his was taken away." Dan read the message aloud to Aaron, and his son reached over, squeezed his father's shoulder. "You did good, Dad. You took something terrible and made it mean something." "We did good," Dan corrected. "You were with me from the start. You're the one who kept asking the right questions, who reminded me that where money comes from matters." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee, watching the world wake up around them. A school bus rumbled past. Neighbors emerged to collect newspapers. Ordinary life, simple and precious. Hugh Penbrook had called 2 weeks ago with final numbers. After all distributions, taxes, and legal fees, there was still money left in the trust, not much, about $50,000. Hugh had asked what Dan wanted to do with it. Dan had thought about it for days before deciding. Yesterday, he'd instructed Hugh to donate the remaining funds to a National Construction Worker Safety Organization, given in Walter Keller's name with a note, "In acknowledgement of failures past and hope for better futures. Let Walter's name be associated with safety now, not just silence. Let there be some small redemption in the public record, even if it couldn't undo what he'd done." "I'm thinking about going back to school," Aaron said suddenly. "Nothing fancy, just some online courses. Maybe study business management, learn how to run a non-profit properly." Dan turned to look at his son. "The safety initiative? Maybe. Or something like it. I've been thinking about what we learned from all this, about legacy, about making things right, about speaking up even when it's hard." Aaron set down his coffee cup. "I want to do something that matters, something that helps people. I've spent so much of my life being the one who needs help, and that's okay, but maybe I can be the one helping too." Pride swelled in Dan's chest, so strong it almost hurt. "You already help. You help me every single day. I know, but I want to help more. Want to turn what we learned into something lasting." Aaron touched the pocket watch in his shirt pocket he'd taken to carrying it with him, Walter's old watch with its promise engraved inside. "Time reveals all truth, but what we do with that truth, that's up to us." Later that afternoon, Dan drove out to the property where Walter's house had stood. The new family had been living there for 3 months now, and Dan had stayed away, giving them space to make it their own. But today, he felt drawn back, wanting to see it one more time. The transformation was remarkable. The glass walls sparkled, finally cleaned of years of grime. Toys littered the yard, a bicycle, a soccer ball, a sandbox that hadn't been there before. Through the windows, Dan could see warm light, hear the sound of children laughing. The house was alive again. It was no longer a monument to guilt and isolation. It was a home. A woman emerged from the front door, the new owner, carrying a trash bag to the bins. She saw Dan standing by his car and walked over, smiling. "You're Mr. Keller, aren't you? The previous owner's grandson?" "I am. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I just wanted to see the place." "Mind? We're grateful every day that you sold it to us. Our kids love it here, and the architecture is stunning." She paused. "Your grandfather was very talented." "He was," Dan said. "He was also very troubled. This house, it held a lot of pain for a long time." "Not anymore," she said firmly. "Now it holds birthday parties and homework sessions and family dinners. Whatever sadness was here before, we're filling it with joy." Dan felt something release inside him, a final letting go. "That's exactly what it needs. Thank you for that." As he drove away, Dan looked back once in the rearview mirror. 2 children had come outside, running and playing in the yard where Walter had walked alone for 20 years. New life replacing old pain. Laughter where there had been silence. That evening, Lorraine came for dinner. Dan and Aaron had made pot roast, and the 3 of them sat around the small kitchen table, talking and laughing. Lorraine told stories about the neighborhood, about changes she'd seen over 50 years of living on this street. She was good company, warm and wise, and Dan was grateful for her presence in their lives. "You know," she said, as they cleared the dishes, "I've been thinking about what you did, Dan, about how you handled everything with Walter's estate. It takes a rare kind of courage to choose the hard right over the easy wrong." "I had good guidance," Dan said, looking at Aaron, "and good questions to answer." "Still," Lorraine continued, "not many people would have done what you did. Most would have kept the money, justified it somehow, told themselves they deserved it. But you gave it back, gave it to the people it should have gone to 40 years ago. That says something about your character." Dan shook his head. "It says more about Walter's character. He kept the evidence, he preserved the truth, even though it condemned him. Some part of him wanted it found, wanted someone to finish what he couldn't." "Maybe," Lorraine allowed, "but he couldn't do it himself. You could. That's the difference between carrying guilt and carrying responsibility. Walter carried guilt, and it destroyed him. You carried responsibility, and it freed you." Later, after Lorraine had gone home and Aaron had gone to bed, Dan stood at the kitchen window with the pocket watch in his hand. He opened it, read the inscription for what must have been the 100th time. "Time reveals all truth." Walter's father had given him this watch with that promise engraved inside, probably hoping his son would live. A life of integrity and honesty. Walter had tried for a while, but when the test came, when choosing truth meant losing everything he'd built, he'd failed. And he'd spent the rest of his life knowing he'd failed, carrying that knowledge in isolation, converting his shame into gold bars that sat hidden and untouched. Dan thought about the single gold bar still sitting in the safety deposit box downtown. 1 kilogram of gold, worth roughly $60,000. His insurance policy, his emergency fund, his reminder that choosing right doesn't mean choosing poverty. But it was just a bar of metal. The real inheritance, the one that mattered, was the watch in his hand. The promise it carried, the challenge it represented. Time reveals all truth, and when truth is revealed, you get to choose what kind of person you'll be. Will you hide it, justify it, run from it? Or will you honor it, speak it, let it reshape you into something better? Dan had chosen. And in choosing, he'd discovered something Walter never learned, that peace doesn't come from hiding your mistakes, but from facing them. That legacy isn't what you leave behind in bank accounts or safety deposit boxes, but in the lives you touch, and the truths you honor, and the courage you pass forward. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator himself, and Aaron, taken last week, both of them smiling. A single father and his son, making their way in the world, doing their best, not perfect, not wealthy, not living some grand story that would make headlines, just two men choosing every day to be a little bit better than they were the day before. To speak truth when silence would be easier, to do right when wrong would be more profitable, to carry forward a promise engraved on a silver watch, that truth matters, that time will reveal it, and that what we do when it's revealed defines us more than any fortune ever could. Dan closed the watch, felt its weight in his palm. Tomorrow he'd give it to Aaron, permanently, pass it forward as it had been passed to Walter, as Walter's father had passed it to him. A promise moving through generations, waiting for someone brave enough to honor it. Tonight, though, Dan simply held it and thought about 3 men who died trying to do their jobs safely. Thought about the families who'd spent 40 years wondering if they were wrong to question the official story. Thought about Walter, broken and isolated, preserving evidence of his own guilt because he couldn't quite bring himself to destroy the truth completely. And Dan thought about himself 54 years old, divorced, semi-retired, raising a son with disabilities, living in a rental house with a leaky faucet and worn linoleum. By most measures, not a successful life. Not the kind that inspired stories or drew admiration. But he'd been given a test, and he'd passed it. He'd found a fortune and given it away. He'd found a terrible truth and spoken it. He'd found an opportunity for easy comfort and chosen hard integrity instead. That was success enough. That was legacy worth leaving. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, Dan Keller stood in his small kitchen, holding a silver watch, feeling lighter than he had in 6 months. The gold was gone, converted to purpose. The secrets were revealed, transformed to truth. The burden was lifted, replaced with peace. Some inheritances came in gold. Others came in the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything. Walter had left both. Dan had chosen wisely. And tomorrow, Aaron would carry that choice forward, adding his own courage to the legacy, writing the next chapter in a story that was finally about truth instead of silence, about light instead of shadows, about redemption instead of regret. Time reveals all truth, and in the revealing, we discover who we really are. Dan closed his hand around the watch, smiled, and turned off the light.